Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Wednesday, August 31st, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm speaking to you the day after I attended the world premiere of the Rings of Power in London. I want to say at the top of the show what a dream come true it was to attend, and thank you to Fellowship of Fans for inviting me as a guest. I had an incredible day meeting friends from the Tolkien Twitter community, talking to and taking pictures with the cast during the red carpet, and most importantly of all, seeing the first 2 episodes of the Rings of Power on the big screen. I want to give you my spoiler-free thoughts in this episode, and while that will restrict me a little bit, it also gives me an opportunity to talk about the broader aspects of this show, which I think are equally as important as individual plot points. Even though I'm incredibly excited to get going, we cannot escape tradition, and must begin as always with a reading from the Professor's work. Today's reading comes from the Silmarillion of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Of old there was Sauron the Maya, whom the Sindar in Beleriand named Gorthar. In the beginning of Arda, Melkor seduced him to his allegiance, and he became the greatest and most trusted of the servants of the enemy, and the most perilous, for he could assume many forms, and for long if he willed he could still appear noble and beautiful, so as to deceive all but the most wary. When Thrangarodrim was broken, and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again, and did obeisance to Eonwe, the herald of Manwë, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that this was not at first falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the lords of the West. But it was not within the power of Eonwe to pardon those of his own order, and he commanded Sauron to return to Aman, and there receive the judgment of Manwë. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation, and to receive from the Valar a sentence, it might be, of long servitude in proof of his good faith, for under Morgoth his power had been great. Therefore when Eonwe departed, he hid himself in Middle-earth, and he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. I thought there was simply no better place to start our journey into the Rings of Power than doing so in the exact same way that Tolkien himself did. Now, where should I begin with my review? Let's start with the big picture. What does the Rings of Power feel like? To me, it feels epic and grand in its scope, plain and simple. I feel like this is something everyone who has seen the episodes has said, but it's worth repeating. From the opening prologue right through to the end of episode 2, this show covers so much ground. As the showrunners have said from their first interviews, the show really takes you to the corners of the map, both a literal sense, but also in terms of exploring aspects of Middle-earth we've never seen in adaptations. It also very much does not shy away from being a fantasy story. This is not in any way a low fantasy show that pokes fun at you for believing in the world. The show takes itself and its setting seriously, and it asks you, the audience, to do the same. Even more so on where it sits within the world of fantasy. I would be shocked if anyone argues in good faith that this feels like any other fantasy TV show. It has a distinct flavour to it, from the visual language down to the dialogue. The cinematography is breathtaking, and I once again maintain that J.A. Bayona is one of the most underrated directors working in the industry today. The use of colour and light, as well as creative camera angles, was marvellous to watch, and it sets itself apart from the pack with that visual flair. The most important thing that I wanted to know going into this show is, what is it actually about? And I don't mean what events or characters from Tolkien is it going to show, but what is this story they're telling actually about? And I can't tell you how much it exceeded my expectations in that regard. The show knows exactly what it wants to be, and I think while your individual interpretation may vary, but this is a show about Tolkien's core themes of love, mortality, friendship, and courage. As I said on Twitter, this show doesn't sit in one tone throughout these episodes. While it skillfully navigates the more serious and deeper moments, there's also levity and joy and plenty of laughter along the way. No character or group of people is simply there to be serious and grave at all times. Neither is that true for those brighter moments or for comedy. There's a variety of tones. Now, I can't pretend that seeing this on a giant IMAX screen surrounded by other passionate fans wasn't an overwhelming experience, but I was also keenly aware how much the show was affecting me on its own. There were scenes within the prologue that made me audibly gasp, exchanges between characters that had me smiling and laughing, and others that resonated with me emotionally and sent tiny fractures shooting through my heart. There were so many characters where the show was fundamentally exploring what was in the heart of each of these characters. This isn't a spoiler, but the very first dialogue in this show, it's not about exposition, it's not about scene setting, it's about our characters grappling with their sense of identity, their sense of purpose. There were scenes that made me tear up in particular. Both were long exchanges of dialogue where characters were grappling with these larger themes of loss and love and friendship. I welled up hearing one of these characters discuss the pain and grief they were carrying with them. That feeling of trying to overcome despair, to find hope and meaning. The other moment that made me get a little teary-eyed was one that explored at its core what friendship means to us, how we cope with feelings of abandonment and estrangement, but also why these relationships are at the heart of what it means to exist. For me, any Tolkien adaptation cannot succeed without coming back to the importance of friendship and love, and this scene in particular knocked it out of the park. I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about once you've seen the episodes. To get a little bit more specific, this show for me absolutely explores Tolkien's writings on the differences between the immortal elves and the other mortal races. How does this very fact of their existence shape the way they see the world and what they value in their lives? It asks the question whether such fundamentally different beings can come together, find common cause, and overcome these differences. And it relates all of this to Middle-earth, the world they share, and how they're connected to it. Tolkien's love for the natural world and for the beauty of it was plain for me to see on screen. Not just the use of New Zealand's obviously gorgeous natural landscape, but the way the camera drew your attention to the inherent beauty in this pastoral scene. Beyond that, the show nails the fact that the world of Tolkien is one that has elements of the Fae and the ethereal woven throughout it. One scene which I can't spoil is perhaps the most magical and otherworldly depiction of this element of Tolkien I've ever seen before. I won't say any more because going in blind to that scene was such a treat, but you'll know it when you see it because it is such, I almost can't find the words, but it is such an audio, visual, emotional treat, and you sort of know it's coming. But when you see it, it's something else. It also feels to me like these characters have a distinct sense of history, whether that's their own personal history or the legacy of their family or their culture's history that weighs upon them. Even within each one of these races and cultures, they're not a monolith, and the individuals within have unique perspectives. We find the elves in this show dealing with the shadow of the horrors of the First Age, each in their own way. Some wanting to continue the fight no matter the cost, others trying to build a new foundation for peace. Especially when thinking about the elves of Lindon and Eregion, each is carrying the weight of their family's history and what they see as their purpose in the Second Age. The same is true for the men of Middle-earth, who are equally burdened by history, but it's a history that they were not alive to see. Put yourself in that culture's perspective. How would you view an immortal race of beings that you know for a fact exist, And how would that inform the way you thought about your own place in the world? The contrast between these two cultures, because of that difference, was fascinating to see on screen. When it comes to depicting the different races and their cultures, The Rings of Power feels like the most lived-in Middle-earth we've seen on screen yet. After just 2 hours, I had a rich understanding of what these cultures valued, what their fears are, and their dreams and aspirations. I'll try to cover what I mean for each culture as best as I can without using spoilers, but again, I don't want to ruin anything that you'll be seeing this week. The Harfoots are in a sense new to the audience. They're hobbits, but they're not hobbits as we know them. And while they may be new, I would challenge anyone to get through these first 2 episodes and not buy into what feels to me a very real culture. This idea of a migratory culture that is so in tune with the land that the dirt isn't just between their toes. It seems to be an intrinsic part of who they are. The sense of family and community is key for this storyline. It was incredibly moving to me, even just moments of warmth or parental kindness. And while each character has their own viewpoint on the world and their own beliefs, it felt to me like all of them were rooted in a deep sense of love and care for one another. As you've seen from the trailers, I suspect that Nori and Poppy are probably going to be our central protagonists for that particular storyline. But the surrounding cast don't feel like sideshows. I already felt like I had a good understanding of their unique worldviews and what they each cared about most. Much more so than in previous adaptations, we get elves that are not without flaws. There is a misplaced feeling among some fans, no doubt influenced by the superb Jackson films, that elves are completely aloof and not vulnerable to what we think of as human qualities. The elves from Tolkien's writings, especially in the First and Second Age, are absolutely fallible, and they do make mistakes. Within the cast of elves I've met so far, we see those who are so weighed down by their history and loss that it is blinding them. We see others that are trying to find their purpose, whether because they feel overshadowed by their family's legacy, or they're trying to determine what their role is in a Middle-earth broken by the First Age. If you've listened to my previous episodes, you know who some of my favourite characters are, and while I won't spoil anything, these are exactly the type of themes those characters are exploring. Not only are these elven characters more complex than previous adaptations, their society feels real. There's a structure and substance to Gil-galad's realm, and the show clearly wants to explore how that functions internally, as well as how it interacts with other kingdoms and other races. Speaking of which, the dwarves at the height of their power in Khazad-dûm is a visual feast. I'm not sure I can properly describe all the attention to detail in these scenes under the mountain, because I need to rewatch it, and I need to be able to pause to take it all in and look at all the minutiae that are in there. I'll get into it more later, but the depth of representation of dwarves is so well done. Considering the limited amount of screen time I had in this particular setting, I'm blown away by how easily I believed in the very realness of this culture. There's little moments of dialogue or background scenery that are easy to miss, but show the craft of the showrunners and writers in developing this dwarvish plot. People who've been begging for more nuance in their adaptations of Tolkien's dwarves will not be disappointed. I cannot stress this enough. They are not just there for comedic relief, they are not there to be short and grumpy, they have layers to them, and it was fascinating to see that in just one episode. Moving to the lands of men, without the grace of an immortal life, or even a prolonged life as the Númenóreans have, this shapes how they interact with the world. Their existence, as perhaps many of us feel in our own lives, is one of survival and perseverance. But because this is a fantastical world that Tolkien built, their issues are greater than our own. They must contend with these other races that seem to have been blessed with gifts inaccessible to them. And when evil begins to rise again, it is they who are on the proverbial front line. Much more so than in Third Age adaptations we've seen, these lands feel truly inhabited. Gone are the barren expanses of Rohan and Gondor. Instead, we're given individual communities that live off the land and must take care of one another. When we talk about the show's first season setting up what's at stake, I find it reassuring that the show is not limiting that depiction to traditional hero archetypes, but it's also about the vast numbers of people who inevitably will be affected by the winds of fate that sweep Middle-earth. I know people will want me to talk about characters and their depictions, which is nearly impossible given the spoiler-free nature of this review, but I'll try to give some high-level thoughts on some of the central characters that appear in these first 2 episodes, and what I think the show is trying to do with them. Galadriel, as played by Morvith Clark, is unsurprisingly going to be a focal point character for Season 1, and the show definitely has a strong vision for how they're depicting this character. As I talked about earlier, Galadriel is not shown to be some perfect, infallible being that never fails or only ever acts in one way. Clark's portrayal is incredibly multifaceted. We obviously see Galadriel's strength of will and determination, but this is balanced by moments of warmth and tenderness. Her scenes with Elrond were easily some of my favourites, and Clark hits every emotional note without missing a beat. Now, as the marketing has suggested, at the core of Galadriel's story is someone who has dealt with tremendous loss in the First Age, and how she chooses to deal with that is clearly going to be at the heart of her Season 1 narrative. I've heard some people say they're concerned the show is turning Galadriel into a one-note warrior archetype, and I don't think that's the case at all. Not at all. What the show is doing is giving us a complex character who is going to have a character arc and develop over time, but all of that will be grounded in her history. We see it in the prologue, we see it in the first scenes, we see it throughout these first 2 episodes, that Galadriel is going on a journey, and it's not just a physical journey, it's a journey into her own grief. It's a journey into her trying to work out how she deals with that, and it's a journey that for me is just beautiful. I really can't stress this enough, that if you are like me and you think some of the most beautiful parts of Tolkien's writings are where he talks about how characters deal with loss and overcoming dismay and despair through hope, then I honestly believe that Galadriel's storyline will be one that everyone could buy into. Elrond, as played by Robert Aramayo, is perhaps the best casting in the entire show. He embodies that character from his very first scene, and while during the Second Age he's not yet the wise lord and lawmaster we come to know at Rivendell, there are hints of that throughout his actions and dialogue. The way Elrond interacts with the likes of Galadriel, Gil-galad, and Durin shows off the intelligence and empathy I'd expect from this character. Yes, Elrond is a herald of the High King, but he has his own individual friendships, and Aramayo definitely nails Tolkien's idea of Elrond being as kind as summer. Even if you didn't know Rob was a huge lore nerd, just like the rest of us, it flows from the screen. I'm particularly interested to see where Elrond's story arc goes in the middle and second half of the season, because there are a range of possibilities based on what I've seen. Perhaps we'll see him move more quickly into a lordly figure. Perhaps he'll struggle between his loyalties to his friends and his king. And perhaps we'll see how he wants to take on the legacy of his father and his mother, and even to an extent his brother. Now, the next 2 characters and their actors were just phenomenal, and I think they're going to be fan favourites, I'm sure of it. Owain Arthur and Sophia Nomvetti, who play Prince Durin and Princess Disa, breathe much-needed fresh air into the portrayal of dwarves on screen. They are as complex and as nuanced as any human or elf character, and if I'm quite honest, they were absolute scene stealers for me. Owain's Durin at first glance comes across as the typical gruff dwarf we're used to seeing, but he absolutely blew me away when given an opportunity to explore the emotional depths of this character. I dare say that he is already my favourite dwarf ever depicted in an adaptation, and that's off 1 episode. Meanwhile, Sophia's Disa forms the perfect character duet with Durin. She is just an absolute delight on screen, and after just a couple of scenes, I feel like I've always known this character. The dynamic between this couple is going to be one of my favourite aspects of the show moving forward, and I can't wait to see where they go. Moving to the wilderness, Markella Kavanagh and Megan Richards captured my heart as the Harfoots Nori and Poppy. You instantly not only believe in their friendship, but it also leaves you wanting each scene with them to never end. I know people have suspected the Harfoots are simply there for comedic relief, and while there are light-hearted moments, this is not the case at all. Both characters embody the Tolkienian courage of hobbits, but each in their own way. One scene where Nori is explaining the reasoning behind her actions to Poppy, I'm afraid that's as spoilery as I can be, was such a beautiful moment of friendship and empathy that it has stayed with me every moment of the day. Mark my words, you will have to have a stone-cold heart not to be moved by these characters. Finally, Ismael Cruz Cordova and Nazanin Boniardi as Arondir and Bronwyn do so much work with their screen time in these episodes. I know some have feared another elf-human pairing could be trite, cheesy, or simply fan service, but it is none of these things. Ismael has this quiet aura of strength that just shimmers off Arondir, but you instantly feel the Sylvan Elf's connection to nature. It's an intense performance, but not a loud one. You feel as if every word is chosen carefully, and Arondir's empathy towards the men of Middle-earth feels so natural. Meanwhile, Nazanin balances Bronwyn's multiple roles as a healer, a mother, and clearly an important member of the village with absolute precision. There's a determination behind her eyes in every scene, and she gets some moments in these episodes that see her character go through the full range of emotions. You feel like you're in the room with her, and Nope, can't say any more than that, also a spoiler. As for their romance itself, it is the opposite of some cheesy Hallmark romance. The show wisely avoids tiresome exposition and tells the story of their feelings for one another, as much with their eyes as it does with their words. I'm not sure where their story will go, but I can already see myself becoming more and more invested in their intertwined fates. I'll also be very interested to see where each of their relationships with Theo goes, because he will be a fascinating character, despite how little I know about him. Now, I could carry on talking about more characters till the cows come home. However, I want to avoid stepping into spoiler territory, which is much harder to do with some characters, and there are also those who I only got very brief scenes with and need to see more before discussing. I'll simply say that Charles Edwards as Celebrimbor, Benjamin Walker as Gil-galad, Daniel Wayman as the Stranger, Charlie Vickers as Halbrand, each of these actors has so much potential here. Charles Edwards is enigmatic in a way that I adore. Gil-galad has a kingly nature that just radiates off the screen. Daniel Wayman has something very primal about his performance, and I obviously can't say more without spoiling. And Charlie Vickers as Halbrand is so intriguing to me. There is something about the way he plays his character that has an inherent sadness to it, and I don't know why that is, but I love it. Now that we've done talking about characters, I know people will want me to talk about how much it sticks to or breaks the law, and listen, while I personally think that looking at adaptation purely through that lens is a treacherous path, I'm happy to offer my view. In terms of the central law tenets, I didn't see anything that broke Tolkien's Legendarium in the first 2 episodes. Now, that may change as the series progresses, but for now the show sits firmly within the world of the books. I can't describe the prologue to you, but it does what it needs to do in a smart and efficient way, working within the rights they have, and whether they had the rights or not to the Silmarillion, it reminds the audience that this isn't a story about the First Age. It's living in the shadow of the First Age, but it's about the Second Age. And so as the lore relates to the prologue, think about what it's trying to tell you emotionally, thematically, and narratively. Don't look for it to tell you the story of the Silmarillion, which I think we all know would require a little more than a prologue. I've seen people ask me whether there were any moments that seemed to sit at odds with the established lore. If I'm absolutely honest, there were maybe 2 small moments of dialogue that caused me to perhaps raise an eyebrow, but they were moments that really just made me want more context, which we may get in future episodes. And fundamentally, they were about the sort of thing that you would have to be very deep into the lore to really not even care about, but have quibbles with. For all I know, they may just be different interpretations on the way I've read the books, rather than going against what's in the books. The important caveat here is, of course, that the show isn't adapting a novelized narrative, like The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. It's adapting what is mostly a historical timeline of the Second Age, one in which we have such sparse dialogue, or details of individual characters and their interactions with one another. The show is trying to depict a story that tells us what happened during these events, but also in the lead up to these events. How did the characters get to events? How do Gil-galad and Elendil get to the Battle of the Last Alliance? How does Elrond become the Lord of Rivendell? How does Sauron rise to power in the East? How do all of these characters come together? We don't have the details of that in the books. So sure, the show's inventing them, but they're inventing them based on the trail of breadcrumbs that, as the showrunners have said, they're taking from the books. Now, I'm sure people will disagree with interpretations of certain characters. I don't find that to be a bad objection. I'm sure people will have good faith disagreements. But for me, it's a reminder that interpretation is what we all do. When you have so little textual substance for characters like Gil-galad, Celebrimbor, Elendil, the show is going to do its best to offer their depiction of these figures. And they may resonate more or less with your own interpretations. And to be honest, they were never going to be able to control that. But try to remember that we're all doing the same thing here. We're all interpreting Tolkien's works, whether it's in our head or in a multi-million-dollar production. And if you have a complaint that perhaps there isn't enough textual support for a character's motivations, well, if they're one of the characters who barely gets a dozen substantial mentions in the books, I'm afraid that's the reality of adapting some of Tolkien's works, which are not complete novels. And I may not like some of them, you may not like some of them, but I doubt there was ever going to be an adaptation that would work for all of you. What I would ask is that people approach it with good faith, and not ask, does this adhere to the lore by the letter, but does it adhere to the spirit of the lore, the spirit of Tolkien, and the spirit of the books? Because for me, that is so much more important than asking the question, was a character in this exact place, in this exact time? Or, I don't know what this character was doing up until this point, but I don't like what they've done with it. Some of these things are understandable, but if you reduce your enjoyment of the show down to it, I think you miss out the joy of seeing a new adaptation. Now, before I finish, I asked listeners on Twitter to submit any questions they had that I could answer, provided there were no spoilers. Some of these are going to cover topics we've already talked about, but I wanted to address each one of them and see if they sparked any new thoughts for me. First up, Emily asks, were there any moments where you were like, surely that's not right, that's a change? If there were, do they make sense in the context of the story, or are they worrisome? So, as I just said in my final part of that episode, there were a couple of moments that I said, that doesn't seem right to me, but it wasn't about a character's motivations or a major plot point. It was more of a contextual detail where I thought, have they simplified one of those areas of the lore that takes Tolkien several chapters to explain to us in the Silmarillion or in the appendices and made it understandable for show-only viewers? Or is it a case of them just taking a new interpretation? I couldn't answer this without spoilers, but also I'm not sure I could answer some of these with spoilers either, because I've only seen 2 episodes. Again, none of them were worrisome for me. They just raised questions, and maybe they'll answer them, maybe they won't. If they don't answer them, that'll be disappointing. But again, none of them were plot-centric. None of them, I think, will have an impact on the overall story. Emma asks, what do you think it will be like watching the remaining 6 episodes on a smaller screen? It's funny. I loved watching it in the cinema. I really did. It's a magical experience seeing Middle-earth on the big screen, hearing the music, the visuals, everything, especially getting to see it at the premiere with all these other fans. But I'm weirdly not devastated I'll be watching the rest at home on my TV, because I was just so overwhelmed by watching it in the theatre. It was almost too much for me. This has been 20 years in the making for me since I first was a child watching Fellowship of the Ring in cinemas, and I actually got quite emotional walking home from the cinema last night because Tolkien for me has in many ways brought joy and comfort to my life when there have been moments of despair. And the last few years, as I'm sure they have been for other people, have been challenging at times. And maybe I'll talk about this more another day, but seeing those episodes in screen was more an emotional experience for me than an analytical experience. And I really look forward to watching the new episodes in a slightly more calm and controlled environment. But if they do ever want to, perhaps put these on in the cinema, I'll be the first to buy tickets. Arendis asks, how well does McCreary's score go with the scenes and imagery? Did it meet your expectations, if you had any, surprise you? Did a score feel different when watching? I can't believe I didn't talk about the music during my main part of the review, so thank you for reminding me. I've been listening to McCreary's score since it's come out over the last couple of weeks. It's phenomenal. Seeing it with the scenes is phenomenal. I almost don't have words for it. It is so moving and resonant at times, but not in a way that dominates the dialogue or the scenery or anything. It's like a perfect accompaniment. It's like having the perfect glass of wine with a beautiful dinner. Did it surprise me? Occasionally, yes, because sometimes a musical theme would come up with a character or scene that I hadn't expected. And that was just interesting because I don't know what that means yet, especially for original characters. So I'll have to wait and see. Did a score feel different when watching? Yes, but I think it's just when you see it all together, it's the complete picture. I don't think it's better or worse, I just think it's different. Archer asks, lore accuracy, how would you rate it as a standalone series and how would you rate it as an adaptation of the text? I think I've already talked about the adaptation of the text part. How would I rate it as an adaptation? Honestly, I don't think you can answer that after two episodes. And if someone tells you, they can tell you how successful or how faithful this will be as an adaptation overall. I don't think that's true. I've given you what I think are my thoughts based on the first 2 episodes, but there's no way for me to tell you whether this is going to be a good adaptation of the Second Age. I think it's got a brilliant foundation. I think I was drawn back into Middle-earth and never found myself needing to suspend disbelief, but I have no idea. As for how I'd rate it as a standalone series, again, I've only seen the first 2 episodes, but I will be shocked if this isn't one of my favourite TV series of the year, of the last 10 years. I don't know, maybe it'll be of all time. A lot of that will depend on where the plot goes and how the show goes from episode 3 onwards. But I would really struggle to believe this is not going to be in my, top 5, top 10 shows of all time. Maria asks, the character introductions, if ever, especially the ones who were made specifically for the show. So I think Maria's asking, what were the character introductions like? They were so clever, because the first time you see each character, it's almost like that saying, a picture paints 1,000 words. The first time you see Elrond, you get the fact that he's as kind as summer. The first time you see Galadriel, you see that she is a noble princess of the Noldor who is going to become one of the most important figures across all 3 ages of Middle-earth. When you see original characters, you get the same feeling, I have to say. You've asked specifically about the original characters. Meeting, who can I give as an example without spoiling anything? Nori. Meeting Nori and the other Halfwits for the first time. They don't do a huge amount of exposition, and that's so appreciated from me anyway. They let you learn about the characters through their actions and their dialogue. No one walks onto set and proclaims who they are and why they're important. You learn it through what they're saying and what they're doing. So for me, I didn't think there was a bad character introduction in the show. There were a couple that were puzzling to me. Well, there was one that was puzzling to me, but the character is a puzzle as well. And so I'm not going to say any more on that because I don't want to spoil anything. Gotstar asks, how is the credits and did the new trailers show too much? The credits, embarrassingly, what happened was there were no opening credits for the first episode. It was a cold open. The second episode had opening credits, but because they played episode 1 straight into episode 2, I thought that the end of episode 1 was then the end credits. So actually, I wasn't paying that much attention because I was turning to the person next to me and we were saying, what did you think? All of that. And I missed the fact that that was the opening credits and only realized as the title came up and then the episode 2 started. It was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. So I'm sorry, I can't give you an honest answer, but they looked beautiful to me. But I'll really need to go and rewatch before I know what they're trying to tell us. As for the new trailers, did they show too much? No, I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because several of my theories and expectations for the chronology of events and what order scenes would come in were proved wrong in the first episodes. There are shots that are misleadingly placed in the trailers, and that's fine. Trailers are meant to do that. But also, you'll be surprised how can I say this? You'll be surprised what leads to certain events. So no, I don't think they showed too much. And I will also say, people have been saying, oh, I think the trailers only showed the first 2 episodes. Not true at all. The trailers are definitely showing footage from all across the season. So I don't think that's anything to worry about. Okay, next up, The Watcher asks, how many different storylines, more or less, are we following in the first 2 episodes? This is actually a really good one because I can answer this without spoilers, no problem here. How many different storylines? We are following, I would say, 3 core storylines in the first episode, and then by the second episode, we're following 4, arguably 5, depending on how you read it. I think that's going to be up to people to interpret whether those storylines are separating. But there's basically 3 core storylines in the first episode outside of the prologue, and those are all very clear and differentiated. Second episode, you start to see more divergence and more intertwining of different storylines and peoples, and so I can't say too much without spoiling anything, but the second episode is where you start to see that branching. But I think the first episode is very clever for a non-book reading audience. It will give them a pretty solid guide on some of the core characters without asking them to try and remember 20 different names in the first episode. So I think it's very smart the way they did the first episode. Even if I preferred the pacing of the second one, I preferred the pacing being a little bit slower in the second episode. Lucas asks, how was the action? This is a really interesting question because I think some people are going into this series thinking it's going to be very generic fantasy where battles are used all the time and fights are used all the time because the pacing is too slow. There's probably, across the first 2 episodes, I would say, outside of the prologue, I would say there's maybe 3, 4... Actually, I think it might have only been 3, maybe 4. 3 or 4 action scenes, and most of these are quite small scale. What I'll say is that they are very intense, they don't overstay their welcome, and they feel important. They feel like the action is happening to tell something about the plot. So they're not just there because, a battle would be pretty to see, or a fight would be pretty to see. They're there to put our characters in peril, or to challenge them, or to show something about them. I'll be really interested to see some of the bigger set pieces we'll probably see in episodes 3, 4, 5, 6 onwards. But for now, it's all quite small scale, but I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed that they were the exception, not the rule, that the majority of the show was about the dialogue and the narrative. Isn't That Interesting asks, do you still lean towards the stranger being a blue wizard? How can I answer this without a spoiler? I don't think it's materially changed my view, but it's certainly widened my thought process on it. And what I mean by that is, just as we've heard from interviews, the stranger is a very mysterious and enigmatic character, but also his actions could be read in more than one way. And, God, this is so hard to talk about without spoiling, but there are things that happen involving him that I think you could read as being indicative of one or two or three different types of characters. So, yes, I'm still leaning towards Blue Wizard, but I don't think I have any more evidence to it. I think between you and me, if you haven't seen the episodes, I have no more of an idea than you do. Seocat asks, how was Galadriel, Elrond, and Gil-galad's interactions? And I assume this means with each other. They were some of my high points. As I said, Galadriel and Elrond scenes, for those of you who read the, I think it was Empire or Total Film magazine, Elrond and Galadriel have a very extended dialogue scene in the first episode, and it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite scenes from both episodes. It's magnificent, it's deep, it's meaningful. It made me want to cry at times, and it made me smile and love these characters in a whole different way than I've seen in previous adaptations. As for Galadriel and Elrond's interactions with Gil-galad, very interesting so far. Very interesting to see where Gil-galad's going, but I now understand a bit better what Benjamin Walker was talking about when he said that Gil-galad has his own idea of what it is that's going to keep his people safe. And that's not necessarily going to be agreeing with everyone around him. It's going to be him as king, listening to other people, but making decisions for what he thinks is best for his people. And I think that's a really interesting starting point. Abby asks, how is Robert Aramayo's Elrond? What is his interpretation like, and does it feel right for the character? I've already talked about it, but one thing that this question made me think was, does it feel right for the character? Yes, absolutely. One of the things Robert Aramayo has talked about is Elrond being at a much younger and different stage of his life than we'll see in the late Second Age, let alone the Third Age. And it's really interesting. It's really, really interesting what they're doing with his character. It feels completely consistent with the lore for me. I'd be surprised if anyone has any complaints about what they're doing with Elrond in the show. That would astound me. And Rob, I never felt like he was channeling Hugo Weaving, but in the same sense that a lot of people came to associate Hugo Weaving with Elrond, I think that will happen, if not more, with Rob. MG Coco asks, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on Galadriel's character and storyline. Yeah, I've already covered that earlier in the show, obviously, but seeing as you've asked the question, I will add one extra thing, which is, I like that they haven't shied away from the fact that Galadriel is noble and proud, and as Morveth has said herself, with pride and confidence and nobility and all these other things, does come a level of arrogance. And that's not arrogance in a pejorative sense, but she thinks she's doing the right thing. And she thinks she is following what she should be doing and what her family would want her to be doing and what is best for everyone. She thinks she is the one who has the right answers. And I love that. Galadriel was one of the only people during the exile of the Noldor to want to leave, not because of Feanor's words, but because she had the desire to lead and rule lands in Middle-earth and to see what she could accomplish herself. So for me, there's a straight line between Book Galadriel in the First Age and where the show is taking her in the Second Age. Someone else asked me where Celeborn is. As Mordvith Clark says, it's a 5-season show. Let's wait and see. For those of you who know, I'm not particularly fussed about Celeborn. He's going to turn up. He'll be an important character, but he's frankly not someone that I'm going to miss if he doesn't appear in the next 6 episodes. Maybe he will, maybe he won't, but he's not going to be someone I'll miss. J.R.R. Tolkien asks, can you share one detail or aspect you didn't care for? So I talked about earlier that there's two things that were lore-specific that I thought were strange, but again, not really major plot points. Something non-spoilery I can share is that I found the pacing of the first episode a bit too quick for my taste. But the interesting thing about that is a lot of reviews from mainstream outlets, from people who haven't read the books, were saying they found the opposite. They found episode 2 a bit slow, and they preferred episode 1. So that may be a personal preference thing, but I like that episode 2 slows it down. And there are climactic moments, but the majority of the episode is really about building out the world and these characters. Finally, we've got a great final question from Eduardo, because hopefully you'll listen to this and then you'll go and watch the first episode, and this will be a perfect question. So Eduardo asks, can you say if the opening of the series is good? Well, categorically, yes, I can say it's good, but I suspect this refers to the prologue, which has been widely publicized, isn't a spoiler, there is a prologue. Can I say if the prologue is good? Yes, absolutely, I loved it. But a lot of people have asked me, is it similar to the Fellowship of the Ring prologue? And to that I would say it is both similar and incredibly different. It is similar in the sense of scale, and my god, there is a visual in the prologue that no one has talked about. It's not been spoiled. Please avoid spoilers if you can. There is a shot during the prologue that comes out of nowhere, and it made me gasp. I almost swore out loud in the theatre, because it was just, I wasn't expecting it. Well, there was actually two, but the second one I can't even talk about because it's such a spoiler related. Anyway, doesn't matter. The one thing that blew me away, it was just, it's not even about the plot, it's about the prologue for the Rings of Power keys you into what the themes are going to be, what the emotional beats are going to be, what you should be thinking about while watching this show. It's not like the Fellowship of the Ring, where what they basically have to set up is Sauron's downfall and the ring. That's all that really matters in the prologue. They tell it very well. I love the prologue, but it is a much more streamlined narrative they were able to tell. You can't really do that. So this is much more about setting the feeling. It is not a big exposition dump. There is exposition, but it's the bare minimum needed to make the show work for book readers and non-book readers alike. And I think that's a very smart choice. I know some people wanted an incredibly long prologue, talking about the Silmarillion for ages. I don't think that would have been a good idea. I know some people would have liked it, but for me, that distracts from what this show is about. So I think they did a really good job. The opening of the series is fantastic, and I was hooked from the first scene. And as I said earlier in the show, the first dialogue you hear is in the prologue, and it is not exposition. Dialogue between characters, and it is not exposition. It is about keying you into, what does this show want us to think about, and what is the theme or themes that the show is going to explore. And I just take my hat off to them, because that is fantastic storytelling. That's going to about wrap up my spoiler-free review for the first 2 episodes for the Rings of Power. It was an incredible experience. I loved watching it. I hope you love it too. And if you're skeptical about the show, all I would say is go in with an open mind and judge it for what it is, not what it isn't. If you didn't want them to make a story based on this loose material, that's okay. But that is what the show is doing. And if you go into it saying, well, I wish this show had wider rights, or was about the Silmarillion, or used unfinished tales, or whatever, I respect your opinion, but for me, that is a very difficult way to approach a show. I always think you should judge it based on what is in front of you. But with that said, thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate everyone who's been following me on Twitter, who's been following along on the podcast, everyone who submitted great questions for today's episode, and I've talked about this on the last episode, but we will be doing several episodes for each episode of the Rings of Power. There will be an episode the day after where I will give my review. That will have spoilers, but it will not be a scene-by-scene breakdown. It's just going to be a maybe half an hour review. Then, a couple of days after, I'm going to have a full breakdown, a full review, and I'm going to be joined by a fantastic guest who I'll be announcing on Twitter in the next couple of days. You will likely already know them, but I'm so excited to have them join me for that. And so every week, we'll be doing an episode breaking down the episode in full, talking about where it relates to the lore, talking about what we expect from future episodes, having discussions. It's going to be great. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or a review on whichever podcast platform you use. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. We're just beginning our journey. The show is almost here for everyone. I cannot wait to go on this journey with you. And thank you to everyone who listens to any episode, whether you listen to everyone or all of them. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. We obviously won't have an episode tomorrow, but we'll be back on Friday with our first ever spoiler review of the first 2 episodes of The Rings of Power. So please, join me then on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.